Everyone. It is said that modern people go to the restroom about 5 to 7 times a day. As living beings, excretion is an essential act we cannot avoid. And sometimes, like during an important meeting or a date, humans even find themselves battling this inevitable physiological need. Surely, many of you have had such experiences. Naturally, even kings from centuries ago and noble women with airs of superiority had similar experiences. However, if we go back several hundred years, the struggles that people of that time faced were incomparable to today's standards. In fact, it wasn't until the late 19th century that flush toilets, like the ones we use today, became common in households. Until then, humanity had engaged in a literal life and death struggle with this intimate yet sometimes fierce natural necessity. So, shall we take a closer look? Let's embark on a journey to uncover the toilet situations from centuries ago. You might want to hold your nose. In the Middle Ages, there were no toilets as we imagine them today. Instead, people relieved themselves into pots or similar containers. During the Roman Empire, ancient Europe had well-developed water systems, such as sewers and public restrooms. However, as the empire's influence faded, waste disposal practices gradually declined, along with sewer technology. As a result, people began using pots to relieve themselves. But what's surprising is how they disposed of the waste. Can you believe it? They would just throw it out. In medieval Europe, waste was disposed of by simply tossing it out the window. After using the pot at home, people would throw the waste out of the window to dispose of it. Naturally, if someone happened to be walking below, they would have a very unfortunate experience. To prevent such incidents, a custom developed, where people would call out before throwing waste. They would first shout "Gardes lo," which means "watch out, I'm throwing." This call was a way to prevent accidents, and people in those times avoided tragic incidents in this way. Throwing waste out the window was a common practice back then, and as a result, the streets of Paris were constantly filled with waste. The roads were reportedly covered in layers of excrement, several centimeters thick. Naturally, the streets were filled with a terrible stench, and the air was unbearable. Especially in the summer, the smell reached unimaginable levels. In the Middle Ages, in densely populated cities like Paris, such unsanitary living conditions were the norm. Nearly every town in Europe had streets known as filth streets or sewage streets. So far, we've taken a brief look at the toilet situations of commoners. But what about the nobility? Yes, as you might imagine, it was equally terrible. Nobles were no exception to the lack of sewage systems. Like the commoners, they also used containers for waste, which they then disposed of outside. Among the items beloved by the nobility at the time was the whole chair. As the name suggests, a whole chair was a chair with a hole in the seat, designed to allow one to relieve themselves while seated. Each chair was customized to the height of its user, decorated luxuriously on the outside, and fitted with a removable tray, made of silver or ceramics beneath the seat. Medieval royalty and nobility were particularly fond of these whole chairs, and numerous anecdotes involving royals and their whole chairs have been passed down. For instance, it's said that Louis XIV announced his intention to marry Madame de Maintenon to his courtiers, while seated on such a chair. Additionally, the Duke of Vendôme, the grandson of Henry IV, would sit on his whole chair immediately upon waking, giving his morning orders to his subordinates from it, and then even having breakfast while still seated. Naturally, he would relieve himself as needed, whether issuing commands or eating breakfast. But why were these whole chairs so beloved? This can be attributed to a popular health belief of the time. People believed that keeping the stomach empty was the best way to maintain health, so they went to great lengths to purge their bodies, often using enemas or laxatives. Naturally, this increased the frequency of waste elimination, and so the whole chair, allowing them to relieve themselves while going about various tasks, became an essential item. Just like the commoners, the nobles also disposed of their waste outside, after using the chair. For example, Versailles Palace had 274 toilets installed, but with nearly 5,000 residents living there, many people couldn't access a toilet. As a result, those living in the palace would relieve themselves in discreet spots around the garden or hidden areas within the palace. Consequently, the beautiful Versailles Palace became filled with human waste and emitted a dreadful stench. Even the luxurious and splendid areas were tainted with filth, and the palace became as foul-smelling as the streets of Paris. At the time, water systems for fountains were established in the gardens and the palace, but the water was primarily used for decorative fountains, and no sewage system was in place. As time progressed, flush toilets that used running water were developed, but they required large amounts of water, were extremely noisy, and needed significant infrastructure, so they did not become widespread. So far, we've explored the toilet situations of both commoners and nobles. Both disposed of waste by throwing it outside, making the areas around their homes extremely unsanitary, as we can see. So, how did people live in such unsanitary environments? In fact, various products were invented at the time to cope with life in polluted cities. For example, parasols. Today, they're used to block direct sunlight, but originally, they were used to protect oneself from waste thrown from windows while walking down the street. Additionally, high heels and boots were invented to help protect people's feet from the waste that accumulated on the roads, and both men and women wore them. Also, there was a risk of waste being thrown from windows onto the edges of the road. So when men and women walked side by side, men would walk on the outer side, while women would walk closer to the center of the street. European men have been kind to women since this era, haven't they? In this way, medieval people were constantly battling the filth that filled their cities. Women, especially those who wished to appear beautiful, seemed to struggle with this. Even if they wore high heels or boots, it was impossible to stay completely clean. When crossing particularly dirty streets, they faced difficulties and would ask a passerby to carry them across. There were so many women requesting this service that a profession specializing in helping people across the road was established, and it became quite popular. Additionally, when it comes to waste disposal, one might wonder what people used to wipe themselves. At that time, paper was extremely expensive. Although paper, invented in China, had reached Europe via the Silk Road, it was scarce and considered a precious item. So using it for wiping was out of the question. So, what did they use? Nobles used materials such as hemp or sheep's wool. However, these were only accessible to the nobility. Commoners, on the other hand, used anything available, such as leaves, seashells, or even apple peels. Interestingly, in medieval times, there was a role specifically assigned to wiping the king after he used the toilet. This position was known as the groom of the stool, although one might think that it was considered an honor to perform such a task for the king. Naturally, everyone disliked the role, so commoners were typically assigned this role. Looking at the miserable toilet conditions in the Middle Ages, it would be nice if all we could say was that it was dirty, but things actually became even worse. People used items like parasols and high heels to protect themselves from the waste-filled streets. But there was an even more dreadful threat they couldn't escape. Waste became a breeding ground for rats, flies, and fleas, which spread infectious diseases among the people. At the time, people had no knowledge of invisible bacteria or viruses to protect themselves. And in the 14th century, the Black Death spread widely across Europe. The Black Death, caused by the plague bacterium, turned the blood dark within the body, and skin turned black from the extremities. It was a terrifying disease, with death occurring within 2 to 3 days of onset. The cause of the Black Death lay in the unsanitary living conditions of the time. Small-scale sewage facilities were built in the Middle Ages to dispose of waste, but the real issue was where the waste ended up. In medieval times, sewage facilities would ultimately flow into urban rivers like the Seine. At the time, people used the water from these rivers for drinking and bathing. As sewage systems expanded later on, the amount of waste flowing into the rivers increased, leading to a vicious cycle of drinking water contamination. Later, in the 18th century, when a large circular sewer system was completed in Paris, even more waste was dumped into the Seine, worsening the water pollution and resulting in a widespread cholera outbreak. People lived in environments nearly buried in waste, and, as living conditions remained unaddressed, the population repeatedly decreased due to deadly epidemics. After several outbreaks of the Black Death, People gradually began to suspect that waste might be the cause. Over many years, sewage systems and public toilets were developed, and waste began to be properly managed. Instead of simply throwing waste outside, it was collected by waste management companies and disposed of in ways that prevented it from flowing into rivers. By the latter half of the 19th century, toilets finally became common in households, and the act of tossing waste out of windows decreased, freeing cities from filth. As cities improved their sanitation conditions, the spread of diseases like the Black Death and cholera subsided, signaling the end of Europe's long dark age of toilets. The toilet practices of medieval Europe were truly astonishing. It's fascinating how common sense can change so drastically with time. The history of the world is still full of mysteries. Let's continue exploring these mysteries of history together. Until our next journey. See you again, and thank you for watching.